Welcome to Back from the Abyss. I'm Dr. Craig Heacock. This is a place for stories of hope and healing, recovery, and redemption. Hillary McBride and I have finalized the location for the upcoming edition of I Love You, I Hate You, Are You My Mom? This is our deep dive into working with transference and countertransference, and it will take place June 18th through 20th in Chilliwack, British Columbia, in the mountains just east of Vancouver. We have a few rooms on site where we are holding the training. It's first come, first serve for those. Please see my website for more info and registration. Next thing, I'm looking for a personal story about body dysmorphic disorder, or BDD. If any of you listeners might be interested in sharing your healing journey from BDD, please reach out to me through my website and we can explore the possibilities. Today's story is about how we love, how we grieve, and how we eventually find some sort of equilibrium thereafter. This episode is a heartbreaking yet beautiful story by Colorado-based therapist Darci Meyers and her journey through multiple losses, grief, and ongoing recovery.
Well, I have been in an apprenticeship of grief for decades. Really started in my childhood with the loss of innocence from sexual violence and sexual abuse. But really in earnest when I was in my 20s. My maternal grandmother, Nancy, suddenly on a November night in 1995, went missing from her home. And my grandfather discovered it in the morning. It took, all of the family gathered, of course, and all of us were very scared, concerned, confused, and were looking for her. All the signs pointed to foul play. And about 2 weeks later, we discovered her body in a shallow grave near the river by her house. This is in a very small rural town in Idaho. Not a lot of resources, not a lot of experience with this kind of a crime. And she died by a blow to the head and strangulation and possible sexual assault. And all the evidence pointed to one man, and he was familiar to the family because he had done some work for my grandmother. Went through the whole court proceedings and all those things, and he was found not guilty of the charges. Later, he was arrested in Colorado for the murder of another woman, which he was then convicted, and he is now maximum prison here in Colorado. So that was a devastating, devastating loss to all of us. I was aware at the time that I couldn't fully feel that loss. I remember at the funeral, I was more aware of the light coming in the stained glass window, hitting the casket, and the dust motes on the light than I was of my own body. And I was aware of it in that moment, but I could not access anything, any emotion. I was frozen. I think this is very much a symptom from my childhood. This was my mid-20s. I was in the process of recovering memories of childhood sexual abuse and beginning to just thaw the dissociation from that time. A lot of my focus was on that. I didn't know how to navigate this loss, and it kind of got frozen in my system along with all that trauma. And very soon after, there was a succession of a lot of other losses. My mother, Kathy, who was first diagnosed with breast cancer when I was a teenager. I think I was 16 at the time, and it had metastasized. And gratefully, she survived. But in 2001, she got a metastatic cancer diagnosis. And I knew that she was only going to die once, and I wanted to be with her. I was living in the Bay Area at the time. That's where I went to graduate school, and I decided to leave my community and to move to southern Utah, where my parents lived, to be with her during that time. And I'm really grateful that I did. And there was another loss there. I didn't really understand the impact of the loss of my community and all the support that I had there, particularly around healing. I had done a lot of healing work with psychedelics around this trauma that had been pivotal for my healing, for my growth. And it didn't dawn on me that loss would be so acute. And it was incredibly acute. And then here I am being with my mother. I had about 18 months with her. That was actually a really beautiful time, before she died. her loss was really quite devastating to my family as well. I don't think any of us really had fully processed my grandmother's death. And I'm sure that was a factor in my mother's illness, to be honest, because
it was her mother.
It was her mother. Yeah, it was her mother. And, you know, there's a certain kind of grief that happens with violent loss that is so different than other losses. It just shakes our kind of safety in the world, shakes us to the core, like our fundamental belief that we're safe. Really,
or fundamental belief that people are good or want to be good.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And so this loss of my mom was huge. And at that time, I was working in hospice, I think in a way to try to understand and digest and metabolize these losses. And I actually always had a real interest in death, even from as a young child, interestingly, and was very drawn to go toward this to try to understand it. You know, what does it mean when we die? What is loss about? You know, and so that hospice work was really supportive for me at the time. And also, I was deeply into the study and practice of Buddhism, again, trying to find some roots that I could make sense of these losses and a practice that could sustain me. And also, there's a lot of teaching in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition about death and dying, and it really helped me to build some kind of a context around this loss and other losses.
So you were drawn to Buddhism in part to try to understand and heal your own losses.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it also, I had an interest in Buddhism actually from as a teenager, actually. And one seminal psychedelic journey that I had really was the catalyst to push me in the direction of studying Buddhism. And that was right before my mother's diagnosis.
What happened? Do you remember any details of that?
I do. Yeah, it was a very big journey. I was working with Pablo Sanchez. He was a Chicano Tewa man who lived in the Bay Area. He did a lot of work. Well, there's a lot of history behind him, I'll just say. And in the journey, this was very close to the time I was recovering memories, and I'd already recovered all the memories from my childhood, the traumatic memories, I'll say. And in this particular journey, it was all about grief. I was grieving deeply all of these losses, and I could see images from my childhood, you know, a picture of my grandmother bringing pie in, for example, from the other room on Thanksgiving, or an image with my father playing baseball, and I would just see these images rise and they would break apart into pieces. And I was grieving and grieving because I'd repressed so much of this abuse from my childhood.
So also the grief, the loss of your innocence.
Oh, in such a big way. And the loss of the family I believed I had, which now, you know, many, many years later, I see both are true. But in that moment, I had to let all that image of who I believed I was and who I believed the family was, I had to let all of those things die. And that was the journey. It was all of these pieces, memories dying, images dying, who I thought I was dying. And in the end, just kind of collapsing into pieces of stories. And then this beautiful deity that I did not know yet, Chenrezig, or Avalokiteshvara, who's from the Buddhist tradition, came to me. And this is the deity that has 1,000 arms and heads and eyes. And I didn't know the story of this deity at the time, but this is a bodhisattva who basically is working tirelessly with compassion to save all beings from suffering. And what had happened in his story is that he burst into a million pieces in sorrow when he saw that all of his efforts were amounting to nothing and more people were pouring into samsara suffering. And in this image, this is what happened in this journey, is that this deity came to me and began to pick up all the pieces of my life and weave a tapestry of a new story, a new life together. And then I became that deity, and started to weave that story of my life. And I think was the first time I felt a sense of agency in my own story and being able to claim my life in the way that I wanted to live my life. And that was a big impetus to find out, like, who is this person who came into this journey? And that really led me onto the spiritual path.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking about the loss of my mother, and there was a multitude of other losses that happened. So after my mother's death in 2002, a dear friend of mine died by suicide. It really rocked my community and rocked me because none of us recognized that he was in such a painful place, that he was suffering so much. So I was also then navigating that and trying to support his wife, another dear friend of mine. And then my paternal aunt, Dana, was diagnosed with lung cancer. And she died in 2005, and she was 47 years old. And she and I were very, very close, and I felt she was one of my allies, within the family system. Not long after she died, my first husband and I, his name was Ray, we divorced, and that's when I moved to Colorado. So it seemed like one right after the other. And of course, I was engaged in my life and work and, all of my responsibilities, and could not at that time digest all of that loss. I didn't know how to. It all happened so quickly.
And not just so much loss, but loss by suicide, loss by murder, loss by cancer, loss by sexual abuse, loss of innocence and childhood, loss of divorce. Like these are like you're hitting like the whole spectrum of like all the awful kinds of ways that we can experience loss.
Yeah. And it was devastating. And yet, again, I was still navigating this thawing out from my childhood and was just doing the very best I could to digest and spend time with those losses. And then in 2006, Ray, my first husband, was murdered just a year after we separated.
Wow.
And it was such a strange circumstance because I was living here in Colorado and I was on my way traveling back to Idaho to visit family, and he'd moved back to Idaho. And I learned on the way that this had happened. I was still very close to his family, and everyone was in shock, myself included. Nobody knew what his wishes were, didn't quite know what to do. And he and I had spoken about it when we were together. And we still very much loved each other. We were still in contact. We just couldn't be married. Mm-hmm. So I was in this position of helping the family to make decisions and seeing his body and saying goodbye to him and being in this role of the grieving widow. And yet I wasn't. So there was so much confusion around that loss as well.
Because who holds much, sympathy for the grieving ex?
Right.
Like, that's your ex. Like, how bad could it be?
That's right.
Yeah.
And again, this level of violence, that takes a person out of life like this, really was so hard to process. And I think for me, that was the moment when grief really, in earnest, broke through. Mm-hmm. And I started to finally feel the impact of these losses. And I remember soon after.
And when was this roughly?
That was in 2006.
2006, okay.
Yeah. So between 1995 and 2006, I had all of these losses. So very quickly. And I was back here in Colorado, and a dear friend of mine, Anne, was visiting me not too long after this to support me. And we were out shopping. We were in some store. And I remember being inside, and all of a sudden the walls started to come in on me, and the ceiling, like I really was aware of how bright the lights were, and I could not breathe. Absolutely could not breathe. And I just ran outside. I was hyperventilating. And I was realizing, I sat down on the pavement and tried to catch my breath, and I was realizing I was having a panic attack. And Anne came running out. She saw me run out of the store, and we were sitting down talking, and I said, I just don't know what's wrong with me. I think I'm having a panic attack. And she said, honey, Ray just died. And again, that flood of intensity and grief came, and I began to understand a little bit. It was kind of the beginning phases of understanding a little bit about how grief shows up in my system.
Even the expression panic attack, to describe what you just were describing there, like, that doesn't do that justice.
Yeah.
That was like a complete, I don't know, like a grief breakdown, release, earthquake.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Seismic.
Not panic attack. I mean, it was, but
Yeah.
that just so makes it so generic, something that was so much bigger than that.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a line in A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. He wrote about the loss of his wife. And I think it's the first line in the book. He said, I never knew grief felt so much like fear. And that was what I was experiencing. I was beginning to understand. And again, because of the violence associated with these losses, how that showed up in my system. And not long after that, I was still working in hospice at that time, and I was doing my chaplaincy residency at a level 1 hospital, level 1 trauma center in Denver. This is where the worst of the worst cases land. The intense suffering in this place. I'd never experienced anything like that face to face. I started to have night terrors working there through the vicarious trauma that I was witnessing and trying to support people through. And it would just happen in the middle of the night where I would wake up and feel like somebody was going to kill me. And I knew enough, and I'd done enough healing work by this point, and I had good support. I knew that this was my childhood trauma coupled with my loss and all these violent losses, and that I needed to metabolize it somehow. So I made a conscious choice not to medicate and to just be with that terror, to try to move it through my system. And so I would go around the house, and I'd lock all the doors, and kind of take my little ones with me and say, hey, the doors are all locked. I'd make sure the phone was charged. I'd have it next to the bed. I had stuffed animals in the bed. And I was in another relationship at the time. We lived together. He was sleeping next to me. And I'd just tell that little one, you're safe. And I'd go to bed. And this lasted, honestly, about 6 to 8 months of these night terrors. And I'd be woken up in the night in utter terror, shaking, my body shaking, releasing a lot of what I've been holding there. And I knew that's what was happening, so I could tolerate it. But I soon realized that I couldn't stay in this position. There were too many reminders of violence to be able to digest. And gratefully that period ended and has not returned.
You had to figure out like a program of self-soothing and safety. What are you going to do to heal your tender heart?
Yeah. And it was helpful that I knew that this wasn't something wrong with me, that this was an appropriate response.
Absolutely.
To really horrible circumstances. In 2015, I left that relationship that I was in, another loss, and moved, and all those things. I was still working in hospice, and I also had a private practice as well. And a friend introduced me to Bob Robert. And we immediately hit it off, although I was not quite ready to be in another relationship. I was still digesting and processing a lot of, these losses, and knew there was more, understanding a little bit more about my grief and needing
even knowing
some space.
On such a deep level that you would lose Bob at some point. I mean, you had so much loss. I think you were just wired like you're going to lose everybody. I mean, we all know that. We're all going to lose everyone, but you have been experiencing that over and over and over.
And over again. Yeah. And yeah, we all know that, but we live in a society that protects us against that kind of loss. A friend of mine who was a palliative care and hospice physician, she'd always joke that America is the only culture that believes that death is an option, right? And we're kind of raised with that idea, right? So, but I was keenly aware of this, and there was a 20-year age difference between Bob and me. I was aware of that too, and so I actually told him, I'm not ready for a relationship, but a friendship is great. And we would spend some time together, over a period of months. And I started to recognize that for the first time, I actually felt regulated with a man, that my nervous system was regulated around him.
First time ever?
Ever.
Wow. Do you think that said something about you or him or the dynamic between you two?
I think probably both. I mean, at this time, I'd done a lot more work on myself, understood myself better. Nervous system regulation was in my vocabulary. And
it's true. If you can't really understand something if you don't have words for it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And I didn't have words early on, and I did at this point. And it was something about him as well. He really was the first man that I ever felt safe with, like really, really fundamentally safe. And I began really just enjoying our time together. And it dawned on me that I'm in love with this man. And I really contemplated this, knowing with this age difference that he would likely die before me. Of course, I didn't realize how quickly that would be. I decided I wanted to be with him, and he did too. We had such a beautiful relationship. And, sometimes I wonder if it was that beautiful because it was so short. We were only together for 7 years. But there was a way that we just fit together, that life was easier together. We never had conflict. Now, it doesn't mean we didn't disagree. Sometimes we'd have lots of heated discussions about things, and we both loved to engage intellectually about topics. But never once did I feel threatened. Never once did I feel like I had to prove anything. I felt like I could be fully myself, and I accepted him fully for who he was. And it was such a beautiful relationship, and I am incredibly grateful that I got to have that experience.
Yeah, just as you talk about him, your whole face lights up. It's really amazing to sit here and just see wow. Because, there have already been some tears and some really heavy moments as you've been talking. And this, just like you just lit up.
Yeah. I feel that way still when I think about him. Yeah. Yeah, and we got married in April 2022. He was diagnosed with lymphoma in July of 2022.
So short.
So short. He was experiencing some transient stomach cramps that didn't have a huge impact on him. And he did see his doctor several times during the course of about 6 months to see if they could identify what they were. They didn't. And one day I had noticed that one of his ankles was swollen. And I asked him, "Did you twist your ankle? Did you hurt yourself?" He goes, "What do you mean?" And he looked down and he said, "No, I'm fine." I said, "No, you're not." And I took him to the emergency room that day. And that's when they found the tumors in his abdomen. And it took about 3 weeks. That's when the medical frenzy began, and tests and biopsies and all the things. And it took about 3 weeks, because it was around the 4th of July, to get the test results back. And during that time, he lost a significant amount of weight. And we knew it was cancer. We just didn't know what kind. And when we got to the doctor's office in Salida, we live in Crestone, so we're going over an hour away to get this diagnosis. I remember it was late on a Friday afternoon. And she had already, when we came into the office, she had a printout for us. And she told us what the diagnosis was and said, and you have to go now to St. Luke's in Denver. Mm-hmm. We said, okay, well, can we go home and pack some things? Or, we have pets at home. We need to get pet sitters. We have to coordinate things. She said, no, you have to go now. And we knew in that moment the gravity of the situation. And so we drove to Denver, 3 hours, and he was admitted to the hospital. And what we found out later was that the tumors had grown so much they were pressing on his kidneys, and he was in kidney failure. But we didn't know that yet.
What a terrible blow.
It was devastating. It was devastating. When these things happen in such an urgent way, there's not a lot of time to say, well, what do we really want here? What are our choices? We didn't have any choices. For him to live, he needed treatment. And we knew in that moment, yeah, we're not ready. We're not ready to make this decision. He was hospitalized for a week. He was receiving continuous IV chemotherapy during that time. We were talking to all the specialists, and the doctor was hopeful, let's say, that this treatment could work. Although we learned much more about the diagnosis as we were going along.
Which was what?
So he had large B-cell diffuse lymphoma double hit. So the double hit part is really the key of what they're describing as double hit is the most aggressive form. There is a triple hit. He didn't have that. He had the double hit. So it described as the way that the genes divide and proliferate and translocate into other parts of the body at such a rapid rate. And we didn't know then, but the survival rate of that kind of cancer is only about 20%. And it had only been first classified in 2016, so they didn't know a whole lot about it. And so, he was getting these cocktails of chemotherapy that were so intense. Then this week-long stay, I would stay with him in the hospital room, and then we'd come home, for several weeks, and twice weekly or 3 times weekly, lab work back into Salida. So lots of driving, lots of travel, lots of long conversations on the couch, and a lot of tears together.
Did you know then, kind of intuitively, that you're going to lose him?
I did. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to admit it. And I was watching this in myself like, I recognize this, my work in hospice and palliative care, being in the hospital system, navigating illness with, family members. I knew it well. But interestingly, in good Bob fashion, he didn't follow any kind of normal trajectory. He never once lost consciousness. He never once was angry. He really wasn't even, he was tired. He didn't feel well, but he wasn't vomiting. He was handling things so well that it was easy to kind of imagine that maybe he could survive.
How and when did it become clear to him that was it?
I think we both had different times when we were having conversations about it. And he said to me, I'm not afraid to die. He was also a Buddhist practitioner. He had a strong, stable presence. And, he lost his first wife to cancer. He was no stranger to loss either. And he lived a really good life. I mean, he was an amazing man. He wanted to be an organic farmer. He bought a piece of land in Northern California, and it was the first organic farmer in the region in Chico. He wanted to build adobe houses. He did that. He built our home. He just had, he was an artisan, a craftsman. He had a certain zest for life. And he said to me, I've lived a really good life. I've done everything that I want to do. I just don't want to leave you. And I didn't want him to leave either.
Yeah.
And there were these moments, that his level of clarity. Also, I think I was still hopeful enough because he was so much himself. Like I said, he didn't follow that normal trajectory of illness. And there was a moment, though, when we had done all the treatment that he could do. We did a kind of experimental treatment that didn't work. And we knew it didn't work. And we were trying to decide what's next step. And we were getting ready for bed, and we were home at this point. And I noticed when I kissed him goodnight that his lips were cold. And I asked him, and I was checking his body. His hands and arms were cold. His legs and feet were cold. And I said, "Do you feel cold?" And he said, "No, I feel fine." I knew that that was a symptom of dying, having worked in hospice. But I was also, again, confused by the fact that he was so just utterly himself, walking, just doing his thing. And we went to bed that night. It was a hard night of sleep. Didn't sleep a whole lot. I kept checking on him that night because I was worried he was going to die. And the next morning, we woke up like normal. We were just lying in bed cuddling, and there was this moment of this numinous clarity where he was sharing his love for me. And it was just this poetic beauty coming from him and his appreciation for me, for our relationship. And he ended that conversation with the phrase, "the marvelous contentment of belonging." And I just sat there as we were cuddling. I was sobbing. And I recognized that that's what it was with him. That's the beauty of our relationship, is I felt like I belonged fully as I am. And he felt that too. And it was such a beautiful moment of recognition, the recognition of our love, and also the recognition of his dying. He also said at that moment, he was looking out the window eventually, and he said, "Is that a buffalo calf out the window?" And I looked, and I said, "Well, I don't see it." And he laughed, and he said, "Oh, I think I'm hallucinating." And I just said, "Well, maybe, or maybe you're getting a visitation." And so we just laughed about that. And he died 2 hours later.
Gosh, what a beautiful final morning.
It was beautiful. Yeah. And devastating.
And devastating, yeah.
And devastating. So during his diagnosis, we saw 2 bison near our house. And we live, in Crestone on the edge, right next to the wildlife refuge. So it's not uncommon for us to see wild game and all kinds of creatures. And we have a strong relationship there with the natural world. But we had never seen 2 buffalo together like this. And so we were talking a lot through the whole diagnosis about kind of the spirit of the buffalo, and really felt that they showed up for us, that this wasn't random. And the buffalo, they're steadfast, they're strong, they're very, very loyal. Whenever there's a storm, they face toward the storm together. They don't turn away like cattle do. And I felt like that's what we were doing. We were like facing this storm together, the 2 of us, ready to deal with whatever we needed to deal with. And that they were continuously giving us that reflection.
I love that.
Yeah. And in many ways, I feel like that was Bob. That was the way he was in life. He went toward the things he loved, and he was courageous and had all of those same kind of qualities. And so we saw them multiple times. And then after his death, I actually had his body in repose in our yurt for 3 days. So I did a ritual washing of the body and anointing the body and be in relationship with him.
By yourself?
Some by myself, some with support. And I really needed that time with him. And friends would also come and say goodbye. And we were doing some spiritual practice in the yurt. And I was telling my neighbors and dear friends who don't live too far away about the buffalo. And they hadn't seen them. And also I was telling them the story of it. And right when we walked out of the yurt, the two buffalo were standing right there. And all of us were we just shuddered in just kind of the sacredness of that moment, that they were so close, and I'd never seen them that close. They were always at a much further distance. And then they left, and I didn't see them again for several weeks because I had a lot of visitors and friends and, coming to say goodbye and supporting me in those early days of grief that were so intense. After everybody left and I was on my own, the buffalo returned. And this time they stayed for 5 months. They just would circle the house. I would see them on the west side. I'd see them on the north side. I'd see them on the east side. And they were with me, and I got to be in relationship with them. And I'd never seen them so up close, so I could really get a sense of their energy, their presence. And I noticed that they were different. So I was like researching, how do you tell a male female from the buffalo female? And I could tell there was a male and a female, and the female was pregnant. And I learned that when the female buffalo is pregnant, she and the male break away from the herd to have the calf, and then they go back into the herd. And those buffalo, they companioned me so well in that winter of my grief, that I knew that they were there to support me, that they were really Bob's spirit envoy, in form, supporting me through that. And the fact that the female was pregnant and he saw that the morning of his death, it helped me being in touch with the more mystical nature of death and the way that we're connected to everything supported me so well in my grief.
That's so beautiful. What did those early, weeks, months of grieving look like? And you had this incredibly powerful experience with the buffalo. Mm-hmm. And what did your grieving journey look like?
Well, initially, I remember really well the night he died, that I was just in bed sobbing and shaking uncontrollably. And I knew my body was releasing the trauma of the loss, because he was right. I was not ready for him to die. I really was not. And I know he held on as long as he did for me. And then in those weeks following, I'll back up and just say, during those first few days, I would get up in the middle of the night because, of course, I couldn't sleep. And I'd go out to the yurt and I'd be all bundled up with my headlamp and I'd go be with him in the yurt and I'd talk to him. And his presence was so palpable in those early days. Like he was still there. And I could almost hear his voice. And he used to say this thing to me if I might get scared at night. And, because every once in a while that little child part would get activated. And he'd say, everything looks better in the light of day. And I would hear that from him. Another thing he'd always say is, everything's going to be all right. And I believed him. And those were some of the things I was hearing as I had my headlamp and I could see the ice crystals in the sky, it was so cold. And I did that every night before cremation. I'll just say in Crestone, we have the only permanent open-air cremation site in the country. And so it's a lovely, beautiful offering to the community. It's a volunteer offering where people can be cremated, supported by the local community. So I was with his body all the way up until the time of the cremation and at the cremation. And my dear neighbors came and brought their van and we transported him to the cremation site early morning. And I was sitting next to his body with his son. And we were talking about memories and, and grief. And I had my hand on Bob's hand. And I was just so keenly aware, like this was the last moment I would have contact with him in physical form. And I just wanted to just be there, to just absolutely be there for every second of it, because I didn't want to miss a moment. And that was so helpful for my grief, to be able to be with him through that process and not see him, taken away by strangers and put in a morgue somewhere. And I got to be involved in that. And that was huge. Once everybody left and I was on my own, the grief really began in earnest. I will say I'm very lucky that I was able to take time off of work. I've been working, as a psychedelic guide and in private practice. And I just said, I cannot work. And I took a year off. And not everybody has the ability to do that. I think the average bereavement leave now in this country is 3 to 5 days. You can't even plan a funeral in that time.
That's absurd.
It's absurd.
Yeah.
Let alone deal with the enormity of this kind of loss. So I feel very blessed that I was able to do that. And I just let myself grieve. And it felt like, it was such a, solitary experience. I know other people lost him too, but nobody lost him like I lost him. And I needed to be alone in that grief. And there was something about, I think I wrote early on in those days, because I'm also a writer and a poet, and that supported me immensely through this journey. And I wrote, there's a certain peace that occurs when the worst possible thing that can happen happens. And it was like that. It was devastating, but it was peaceful, because all of those carefully constructed defenses against loss and impermanence and death, and the knowledge that everyone I love is going to die and I'm going to die, and that we don't live with on a day-to-day basis, they were gone. And I was just in relationship with this raw truth. And it brought me right into the present moment. There was nothing else. And I was able to just be with that grief, collapse in that grief, scream in that grief. I actually have a poem I wrote about that, if
yes, please.
I could read that. It's called Rewilding. There's a kind of rewilding happening in my body, the primal instinct to shake, to wail in ways known only to the somatic legacy of loss. The mind, simply a witness in this wilderness of grief. Grief is wild, untamed, unashamed. I have never heard such a feral sound come from a body as during the wailing days of grief. Spontaneous cries and growls erupted without knowledge or consent in this wild animal body. Wailing to the wind as it plastered hair to my wet face. Wailing to the mountains that reach high, unmoved, as if my beloved didn't just die. Wailing to the fire that took his body in sacred smoke and ash to the welcoming sky. Wailing to the water in prayer to quench the dry, dusty thirst of loss. Time is irrelevant here. Everything is irrelevant. Only the shorn heart remains. How does it possibly keep on beating?
Thank you. So you're writing your poetry, that That was a critical part of the process, and
It was.
your Buddhist teachings and community.
Yeah. And my relationship to the animate world. I think the intersection of writing, grief, and the animate world is really where I found solace and support, where I could just sit with this internal experience of grief that felt that wild and untamed, and see that same wildness reflected back to me in the animate world. And, it was winter and everything was dead, and feeling like the support of that, the solidarity with winter, that winter matched what I felt inside. And
maybe it was okay to be dormant for months.
Absolutely.
Maybe it was okay to be still and non-productive and non-blooming and just wait it out.
that's it. It's exactly it. And I gave myself full permission to do that. I remember there would be times when I would think to myself, when did I shower last? When did I eat? And often I wouldn't know, and I was okay with it. There was another time I remember I was on the couch, and the couch was a special place for him because he would read there every day. He was an avid reader. I mean, he would go through a novel a week, and he would lie on the couch after lunch and take a little, siesta and read. And so I loved being on the couch in those early days. And at one point I remember thinking, am I getting depressed? I can't get off the couch. And I said to myself, it's okay. You'll get off the couch when you're ready. And it was true. Another week passed and I was ready to get off the couch. Now I was back on it again, not so long later. But I was giving myself full permission to do that and to write about grief from the inside, to be with it as a contemplative practice of tending grief. This tending grief, it really became my practice. I love what Francis Weller says about grief. He calls it soul hygiene. And it felt like I could do nothing else but that. If life required something of me, I couldn't do it.
Yeah. I might just say, listeners, for those of you who don't know Crestone, it's one of the most beautiful places in Colorado. It's just north of the sand dunes, next to 14,000-foot peaks in this National Wildlife Refuge. And truly, I'm actually getting chills imagining you, as you said, the animate world helped you heal, and the San Luis Valley is just one of the most spectacular places on the planet, and one of the coldest places in America.
And particularly at night, and the desert, the high mountain desert, and in winter. And it was the first time I think I properly wintered, that I let myself absolutely stop, that I let life stop. And I was so in touch with the seasons, and I wrote a lot about, like those first signs of spring and like the swelling. I could be in relationship with the buds swelling in a way that I have never done before, to the return of the mountain bluebirds, like just those moments that I might otherwise miss.
Did you start to, if you will, wake up when the spring came? I mean, did you find No. You were like a 13-year cicada. I'm going to come out, and I still need some time.
In fact, I was pissed. I wanted it to stay winter.
Oh, yeah.
Interestingly, I wasn't ready. And I was writing about that. I'm not ready. I can see this is happening outside, and I'm not ready. And then summer came, and all the tasks outside, we have a big greenhouse, asparagus patch, and things to take care of outside. And I was worried that, can I do this on my own? These are the things that Bob used to always do. And can I do it by myself? So I also had, during those early days, lots of anger, lots of fear, lots of peace, lots of everything. And trying all the things for the first time alone. I was really aware of okay, this is the cleaning of the asparagus patch to get it ready, right? Putting on the compost. I'd never done that. I watched him do it. I'd never done it, cleaning out the greenhouse and going, oh yeah, and he made compost tea. Well, what if I did that? And all the things that I had to do for the first time by myself.
How and when did other people come in? Because again, I'm having just this powerful, cold vision, of you spending that winter, but it's so beautiful. I'm imagining you in Crestone. How and when did other people, loved ones, therapists, colleagues, how did they start to enter your healing journey?
Yeah. Well, they were always on the periphery, and I always had contact with my dear ones, and they were checking in on me, and I had a weekly time when I'd get together with my girlfriends. And that was a really important touch point for me because I would have easily just stayed alone. And that felt supportive too, but I did need that social contact. I have a singing group. I'm in the Threshold Choir in Crestone. The Threshold Choir is actually an international organization of a cappella singers who sing at the bedside of the dying. And I joined that group after Bob died, and a lot of my friends were there. And I really felt like singing with them every week was part of like singing me back into wholeness, singing me toward health, singing me toward love.
Singing with others is about the most ecstatic thing that we can experience.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And the songs in the repertoire of the Threshold Choir are all those kinds of threshold songs, and they're like death lullabies and grief lullabies. And so the content was timely for me and such a service to me.
Did you have actual, therapeutic help? Did you have a therapist or other people you worked with to specifically kind of address grief, or was it more sort of organic in the ways that you're describing right now?
I didn't. And I thought about it several times, being a therapist and doing this work. And I knew that I wanted to have my own experience. And I knew what was happening. I wasn't surprised by anything. I was devastated. But I knew what was happening, and I could just allow it to happen. And that being said, I have a lot of friends who are therapists. And of course, I had lots of beautiful conversations. I had incredible support. I had navigated so much of this loss that I knew what to expect, although it did certainly take me to another level. And, what I have found is any new loss that we have brings all of our losses clearly into focus. And anything that's unresolved or unprocessed also comes along. Mm-hmm. Just the year that, I think it might have been the year that Bob died, or maybe the year before, a book came out about the death of my grandmother. Reading that book really brought all of that, that experience into focus. And then, of course, Bob got sick, and that took precedence. But that death was not fully processed for me. And it certainly came up during this time as well. And particularly living alone, in this high mountain desert on the edge of the world, it seems at times, really beginning to ask myself, like, how do I find this sense of safety and security within myself that I felt so much with him? Mm-hmm. I wasn't sure I could find it, to be honest. And I did have the support, as we talked about, of the animate world, which really, it was the missing piece from before that I hadn't made the connection with. And yeah, but I didn't know for sure. Mm-hmm. But I knew I had to be with it. I knew I had to be with it. And that was what I did.
Yeah. Have there been some markers or times that you look back the last couple of years and you now think that you sort of reached a new level of healing or Or has it been more of a gradual kind of insidious process that you can't really point to like, oh, I got a lot better here, or this was a marker that I'd reached a new level of?
It's been much more gradual than that. And I think what this loss has taught me is that I have been and will always be in this apprenticeship with grief, that it's never over. There's never a time I have not had these losses. There's never a time they haven't shaped me. What I can say is I feel an inner resilience having faced them. Grief, like psychedelics in many ways, takes a life and just shakes it up completely. Oftentimes when I'm describing psychedelic work, I talk about the snow globe. You shake the snow globe and everything lands in a different place eventually. And this kind of grief, it breaks the snow globe open. There's a certain kind of feeling so wide open, being laid bare, that all the typical defenses no longer are active or can even function in that. And I think knowing grief in this way, that I know it now, is one of the gifts that Bob gave me. Because I understand, impermanence in a different way. I also understand how much I don't know in this great mystery. And one of my teachers, Angela Sarian, she'd always say that life is a mystery to be lived, not a problem to be solved. And I think I aim to live in that mystery, because the truth is I don't know. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Yes, I'm not in a acute phase of grief anymore, but I could just be walking down the street and be hit by it for no apparent reason. Mm-hmm. Just the other day, I was washing dishes on Sunday, just washing dishes in the morning. And grief hit me as if somebody punched me in the stomach. And I just started sobbing and wailing. And
was it all the grief or Bob grief? Or
it was just grief.
Just grief.
It wasn't even attached to anything. I think there was a moment of recognition. I had just learned about another death in Minnesota, and feeling the grief associated with that on a cultural level, and the grief around our personal safety in this country. And that was probably a component of it, but it was just grief. Mm-hmm. Part of this apprenticeship of grief for me is to just allow that to happen. And there's a certain kind of, in the early days, it felt like a discipline of grieving, mm-hmm. like allowing myself to go toward this thing the worst possible thing that could happen, and be with it, get to know it. Mm-hmm. And now it feels a little more like devotion, like a devotion to grief, because we only grieve because we love. And I want to keep on loving. Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine opening your heart to someone else and having another partner?
I can, yeah. I can now, 3+ years later.
Yeah, well, that seems like a real marker.
Yeah.
Almost, I'm just imagining like when you lose a beloved pet and you just can't imagine. And then at some point you get a new little fur ball, mm-hmm. and you think, oh, it's like in The Grinch where his heart grows bigger and bigger. Like there is extra room for this new kitty.
There is extra room.
Yeah, or this new man, or this new stepmother, or whatever. Like, there is more room to love.
There's room. And I love that you name that, because often an image I use around grief with clients and students is a jar, which is our container, us, and inside that a ball of string. And that ball of string takes up the entire inside of that jar. And I think a lot of times people feel like they have to pull that string out and they have to get rid of it, so that they have more room for other things. And instead, our jar gets bigger. The grief is still that ball of string, but now suddenly we have room for more love, for more connection, for deeper awareness of the fragility of life, all of it.
One of the outcomes of this process of grief is that you wrote a book.
Mm-hmm.
And the title is The Marvelous Contentment of Belonging. And I guess it's not quite out yet, this spring coming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, tell me about what is this book telling? What's it bringing us?
Yeah, I talked about the relationship to the seasons. So the book has 4 sections, one for each of the seasons. Most of the poetry written was in that liminal space, after death. Some poems, like about the death of my mom, that's in here, were other losses, and something about Ray is in here. But really, I was writing poetry as part of my healing process, not knowing I would actually pull together a compilation. But I have been writing poetry for many, many years, on and off. I didn't really take the craft that seriously until recent years. But grief kind of catapulted me right into the present moment with my experience, that was the thing. Creative writing was the thing that could help me metabolize this loss. So that's what a lot of the poems in here are about. And at the end of each section, there are questions to help the reader ponder their own losses and help them begin to think how they might be able to tap into their own creativity to process their losses.
Well, that sounds wonderful. Yeah, I look forward to seeing that.
And about this apprenticeship of grief, I have a poem I'd like to read around that.
Please do.
I'll just start by saying there's a word here in this first line that I'll define. It's synodic. Synodic is when 2 planets in the cosmos are in a relationship cycle with one another.
Is that SYNOD?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. In the synodic eloquence of love, there is a limbic resonance, a reverberation that softly announces life, sings disputations against sorrow as joy bids its return to the trees. Slowly, gravity releases the sun, now rising higher into the late winter sky, while your distant voice sings color into the darkness. I try softer in the delicate wandering mist of morning. There are no enemies inside, just the remembrance of stars kindled by that distant song. This apprenticeship of grief stretches a life wide open, then coaxes into good humor, gradually over time, as the beckoning sun ascends, welcoming me home again and again.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming up here to see me.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, it's been what a lovely hour to sit down and make this with you. Thank you. We only grieve because we love. I love this quote so much, and I think it illustrates one of the central existential dilemmas of being a human being. Either we can isolate ourselves, we can put up our walls and avoid connection, and thereby ensure both safety, but also numbing nihilistic emptiness. Or we can take the risk of becoming vulnerable, of deeply connecting and caring and loving, while fully knowing that we will all lose everyone and everything we've ever known and loved. But our humanness compels us towards the latter. We have to love, and thus we have to grieve. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Thank you so much for listening.